This is quite a long story, so it's in two parts. This is part one of The Devoted Friend. One morning, the old water rat put his head out of his hole. He had bright beady eyes and stiff grey whiskers, and his tail was like a long bit of black India rubber. The little ducks were swimming about in the pond, looking just like a lot of yellow canaries, and their mother, who was pure white with real red legs, was trying to teach them how to stand on their heads in the water. "You'll never be in the best society unless you can stand on your heads," she kept saying to them, and every now and then she showed them how it was done. But the little ducks paid no attention to her. They were so young that they didn't know what an advantage it is to be in society at all. "What disobedient children!" cried the old water rat. "They really deserve to be drowned." "Nothing of the kind," answered the duck. "Everyone must make a beginning, and parents cannot be too patient." "Ah, I know nothing about the feelings of parents," said the water rat. "I'm not a family man. In fact, I've never been married, and I never intend to be. Love is all very well in its way, but friendship is much higher. Indeed, I know of nothing in the world that is either nobler or rarer than a devoted friendship." "And what, pray, is your idea of the duties of a devoted friend?" asked a green linnet, who was sitting in a nearby willow tree and had overheard the conversation. "Yes, that's just what I want to know," said the duck, and she swam away to the end of the pond and stood on her head, in order to give her children a good example. "What a silly question!" cried the water rat. "I should expect my devoted friend to be devoted to me, of course." "And what would you do in return?" said the little bird, swinging upon a silver spray and flapping his tiny wings. "I don't understand you," answered the water rat. "Let me tell you a story on the subject," said the linnet. "Is the story about me?" asked the water rat. "If so, I'll listen to it, for I am extremely fond of fiction." "It is applicable to you," answered the linnet, and he flew down, and, alighting upon the bank, he told the story of the devoted friend. "Once upon a time," said the linnet, "there was an honest little fellow named Hans." "Was he very distinguished?" asked the water rat. "No," answered the linnet, "I don't think he was distinguished at all, except for his kind heart and his funny, round, good-humoured face. He lived in a tiny cottage all by himself, and every day he worked in his garden. In all the countryside there was no garden as lovely as his. Sweet William grew there, and gillyflowers, and shepherd's purses, and fair maids of France. There were damask roses and yellow roses, lilac and gold crocuses, and purple and white violets, columbine and lady smock, marjoram and wild basil, the cowslip and the flower de luce, the daffodil and the clove pink, bloomed or blossomed in their proper order as the months went by, one flower taking another flower's place, so that there were always beautiful things to look at and pleasant odours to smell. Little Hans had lots of friends, but the most devoted friend of all was Big Hugh the miller. Indeed, so devoted was the rich miller to little Hans that he would never go by his garden without leaning over the wall and plucking a large nosegay or a handful of sweet herbs, or filling his pockets with plums and cherries if it was the fruit season. Real friends should have everything in common, the miller used to say, and little Hans nodded and smiled, and felt very proud of having a friend with such noble ideas. Sometimes, indeed, the neighbours thought it strange that the rich miller never gave little Hans anything in return, even though he had 100 sacks of flour stored away in his mill, and 6 cows, and a large flock of woolly sheep. But Hans never troubled his head about these things, and nothing gave him greater pleasure than to listen to all the wonderful things that the miller used to say about the unselfishness of true friendship. So little Hans worked away in his garden. During the spring, the summer, and the autumn, he was very happy. But when the winter came and he had no fruit or flowers to take to the market, he suffered a lot from cold and hunger, and often he had to go to bed without any supper but a few dried pears or some hard nuts. In the winter he was also extremely lonely, as the miller never came to see him. "There's no good in my going to see little Hans as long as the snow lasts," the miller used to say to his wife, "for when people are in trouble they should be left alone and not be bothered by visitors. That at least is my idea about friendship, and I'm sure I'm right. So I shall wait until the spring comes, and then I shall pay him a visit, and he'll be able to give me a large basket of primroses, and that will make him so happy." "You're certainly very thoughtful about others," answered his wife, as she sat in her comfortable armchair by the big pinewood fire. "Very thoughtful indeed. It's quite a treat to hear you talk about friendship. I'm sure the clergyman himself could not say such beautiful things as you do, although he does live in a 3-storied house and wear a gold ring on his little finger." "But could we not ask little Hans up here?" said the miller's youngest son. "If poor Hans is in trouble, I'll give him half my porridge and show him my white rabbits." "What a silly boy you are!" cried the miller. "I really don't know what's the use of sending you to school. You seem not to learn anything. Why, if little Hans came up here and saw our warm fire and our good supper and our great cask of red wine, he might get envious, and envy is a most terrible thing, and it would spoil anybody's nature. I certainly won't allow Hans's nature to be spoiled. I'm his best friend, and I will always watch over him and see that he's not led astray into any temptations. Besides, if Hans came up here, he might ask me to let him have some flour on credit, and I couldn't do that. Flour is one thing, friendship is another, and they should not be confused. Why, the words are spelt differently, and they mean quite different things. Everybody can see that." "How well you talk," said the miller's wife, pouring herself out a large glass of warm ale. "Really, I feel quite drowsy. It's just like being in church." "Lots of people act well," answered the miller, "but very few people talk well, which shows that talking is much the more difficult thing of the two, and much the finer thing also." And he looked sternly across the table at his little son, who felt so ashamed of himself that he hung his head down and grew quite scarlet and began to cry into his tea. But he was so young, you must excuse him. "Is that the end of the story?" asked the water rat. "Certainly not," answered the linnet. "That's the beginning." "Then you're quite behind the age," said the water rat. "Every good storyteller nowadays starts with the end, and then goes on to the beginning, and concludes with the middle. That's the new method. I heard about it the other day from a critic who was walking round the pond with a young man. He spoke of the matter at great length, and I'm sure he must have been right, for he had blue spectacles and a bald head, and whenever the young man made any remark, he always answered, 'Pooh!' But pray, go on with your story. I like the miller immensely. I have all kinds of beautiful sentiments myself, so there is a great sympathy between us." "Well," said the linnet, hopping now on one leg and now on the other, "as soon as the winter was over and the primroses began to open their pale yellow stars, the miller said to his wife that he would go down and see little Hans." "Why, what a good heart you have," cried his wife. "You're always thinking of others. And mind you take the big basket with you for the flowers." So the miller tied the sails of the windmill together with a strong iron chain and went down the hill, with the basket on his arm. "Good morning, little Hans," said the miller. "Good morning," said Hans, leaning on his spade and smiling from ear to ear. "And how have you been all the winter?" said the miller. "Well, really," cried Hans, "it's very good of you to ask, very good indeed. I'm afraid I had rather a hard time of it, but now the spring has come and I'm quite happy, and all my flowers are doing well." "We often talked of you during the winter, Hans," said the miller, "and we wondered how you were getting on." "That was kind of you," said Hans. "I was half afraid you'd forgotten me." "Hans, I'm surprised at you," said the miller. "Friendship never forgets. That's the wonderful thing about it. But I'm afraid you don't understand the poetry of life. How lovely your primroses are looking, by the way." "They are certainly very lovely," said Hans, "and it is a most lucky thing for me that I have so many. I'm going to take them to the market and sell them to the burgomaster's daughter, and buy back my wheelbarrow with the money." "Buy back your wheelbarrow? You don't mean to say you sold it? What a very stupid thing to do." "Well, the fact is," said Hans, "that I had to. You see, the winter was a very bad time for me, and I really had no money at all to buy bread with. So I first sold the silver buttons off my Sunday coat, and then I sold my silver chain, and then I sold my big pipe, and at last I sold my wheelbarrow. But I am going to buy them all back again now." "Hans," said the miller, "I will give you my wheelbarrow. It's not in very good repair. Indeed, one side is gone, and there's something wrong with the spokes. But in spite of that, I will give it to you. I know it's very generous of me, and a great many people would think me extremely foolish for parting with it. But I'm not like the rest of the world. I think that generosity is the essence of friendship. And besides, I've got a new wheelbarrow for myself. Yes, you may set your mind at ease. I will give you my wheelbarrow." "Well, really, that is generous of you," said little Hans, and his funny round face glowed all over with pleasure. "I can easily repair it, as I have a plank of wood in the house." "A plank of wood?" said the miller. "Why, that's just what I want for the roof of my barn. There's a very large hole in it, and the corn will all get damp if I don't repair it. How lucky you mentioned it. It's quite remarkable how one good action always breeds another. I have given you my wheelbarrow, and now you are going to give me your plank. Of course, the wheelbarrow is worth far more than the plank, but true friendship never notices things like that. Pray get it at once, and I will set to work on my barn this very day." "Certainly," cried little Hans, and he ran into the shed and dragged out the plank. "It's not a very big plank," said the miller, looking at it, "and I'm afraid that after I've mended my barn roof, there won't be any left for you to mend the wheelbarrow with. But of course that's not my fault. And now, as I've given you my wheelbarrow, I'm sure you'd like to give me some flowers in return. Here's the basket, and be sure to fill it right up." "Fill it right up?" said little Hans, rather sorrowfully, for it was really a very big basket, and he knew that if he filled it, he would have no flowers left for the market, and he was very anxious to get his silver buttons back. "Well, really," answered the miller, "as I've given you my wheelbarrow, I don't think it's much to ask you for a few flowers. I may be wrong, but I should have thought that friendship, true friendship, was quite free from selfishness of any kind." "My dear friend, my best friend," cried little Hans, "you are welcome to all the flowers in my garden. I would much rather have your good opinion than my silver buttons any day." And he ran and plucked all his pretty primroses and filled the miller's basket. "Good-bye, little Hans," said the miller, as he went up the hill with the plank on his shoulder and the big basket in his hand. "Good-bye," said little Hans, and he began to dig away quite merrily. He was so pleased about the wheelbarrow. And that's the end of part 1.